At the turn of the 20th century, a storm of hardship pushed waves of Azorean and Madeiran families across the Atlantic. They landed in the booming mill town of Fall River, Massachusetts, not just seeking work, but yearning to rebuild life from scraps of memory and salt. Behind brick tenement walls, something remarkable happened. Kitchens stirred to life, blending old-world traditions with new realities. Food became more than survival. It became identity. Imagine streets buzzing with the clang of shift bells, and the scent of garlic, wine, and wood smoke weaving through alleys. These were not just meals. They were declarations that home could still exist, even an ocean away. In this journey, we're exploring 25 dishes that didn't just feed bodies. They built a culture that still simmers today in every pot of soup, every slab of sausage, and every warm, sweet roll. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you believe food tells the best stories. Leave a comment anytime a dish sparks a memory. We'd love to hear how your family keeps traditions alive. Bacalhau à gomes de saïne, the packed flats of early Fall River. This dish was more than a family recipe. It was a ritual. Salt cod, or bacalhau, was the lifeline of the immigrant kitchen. Affordable, shelf-stable, and brimming with the flavor of home. In each cast-iron pan, you'd find layers of softened onions, boiled potatoes, and delicate flakes of cod revived in water overnight, nestled between slices of hard-boiled eggs and richly bathed in olive oil. For families fresh from the Azores or Madeira, it wasn't just sustenance, it was solace. After backbreaking 12-hour mill shifts, this dish brought everyone around the table as equals. It fit lunch tins, fed large broods, and carried with it whispers of Atlantic sea winds and coastal kitchens. Even now, in modern bakeries and old-school diners lining the city's streets, bacalhau à gomes de sa remains a direct line to 1905. This isn't just cod and potatoes. It's cultural permanence. One bite, and you're anchored in something older than memory. Casoila, this dish didn't cook in minutes. It simmered in stories. Pork shoulder, soaked overnight in red wine, garlic, bay leaf, and paprika, then stewed for hours until it surrendered to the spoon. Casoila wasn't just food. It was a Sunday soul ritual. In the mill-era apartments of Fall River, its aroma filled halls, pushing through floorboards, drawing neighbors from every unit. What started humbly became sacred. Clay pots bubbled gently, while children tore hunks of bread to dip in oily spice sauce so rich no one cared it didn't come trimmed in silver. Even in weeks when wallets were light, this dish stretched. One pot could nourish a family in half the block. But it also rose higher, becoming a centerpiece at festivals and Holy Ghost feasts. It wasn't just hearty pork. Casoila was communion, shared, savored, and celebrated like prayer passed through generations. Bifanas to taste the real rhythm of working-class life in Old Fall River. Bite into a bifana. Simple? Maybe, but sacred to the people who made it sing. Thin pork cutlets, marinated in garlic, wine, and smoky paprika, seared quickly and tucked into a Portuguese roll that could hold its own, maybe with a ribbon of mustard, maybe just drenched in its own juices. Fast, filling, fierce. This was real food for real days. Mill workers on short breaks, lined up at taverns or tiny storefronts, getting two in their hands and warmth in their belly. These were the muscle behind every brick laid and every sleeve soaked with sweat. And yet somehow these humble sandwiches became legend. Even now, when festivals light up the streets, bifanas sizzle on the grill, not because they're trendy, but because they're tradition wrapped in paper. This isn't just pork and bread. It's a bite of blue-collar glory, alive with garlic and grit. Linguiça and chorizo, sausage platter with fried potatoes. The Portuguese kitchen had a heartbeat. It thumped with the rhythm of sausage on the stove. Linguiça and chorizo, smoky links packed with garlic, paprika, and red wine, suspended. From wooden rafters and cured with time and tradition, were the pride of every pantry. Add fried potatoes, sizzling in pork fat until golden, and every mill worker had a feast waiting. Linguiça, smooth and deeply garlicky. Chorizo, bold and fire-edged. Side by side, they sung of inheritance. Kids would wrap slices in bread before dashing off to school, while fathers, exhausted from the mills, tucked them into lunch tins, knowing each bite reminded them of their ancestors. But this wasn't just a plate of protein and starch, it was durability on display. Today, Fall River's storefront windows hang fresh sausage coils like garlands, just as they did a century ago. That's not nostalgia, that's heritage preserved in smoke and spice. Seafood rice, arroz de marisco. When ocean met tenement, something beautiful boiled in Portuguese pots, arroz de marisco. Fall River's proximity to the sea wasn't lost on immigrant families who had grown up pulling nets from Atlantic tides. A smoky garlic tomato broth, seasoned with a pinch of saffron or paprika, cradled clams, shrimp, mussels, sometimes even squid, whatever the boats brought in that week. Rice was the base, yes, but the soul was in the salt water. Families guarded Sunday servings like heirlooms. One ladle could feed many and still feel lavish. In narrow kitchens, spices mingled with fish aroma until entire buildings smelled like celebration. Every spoonful told dual stories of their past lives on rugged coastlines and their new beginnings in soot-dusted mill towns. And still today, a steaming pot of seafood rice implies one thing, that somewhere in Fall River, someone is choosing beauty over hardship, one grain at a time. Sweet malasadas with sugar and orange zest. When the gray skies hung low and long shifts seemed unending, sweet malasadas brought a golden reason to smile. Soft dough, rich with eggs and butter, was shaped lovingly by hand before diving into hot lard, puffing into golden pillows. As they emerged, still warm, they were tossed in sugar. Some kissed with orange zest, bright as sunshine on a cold Massachusetts morning. In the working neighborhoods of Fall River, these weren't everyday treats. They were for the days that really mattered. Lent, family feasts, saints' days. If you were lucky as a child, someone handed you one still so hot the sugar melted in your fingers. And on festival weekends, mothers and grandmothers rose before dawn, frying batch after batch, while laughter echoed through tight stairwells. A malasada wasn't just dessert. It was glory, joy, and childhood wrapped in one sweet burst. And here's the truth. A century later, crowds still gather for them, letting sugar-coated memories melt across generations. Carne de porco a alentejana, some dishes didn't just nourish the body, they told a saga of earth and sea. Carne de porco a alentejana is one of them. Imagine this. Chunks of pork, slow-cooked in garlic and white wine until golden and crisp. Now add clams, fresh, briny, still tasting of the ocean. Toss in fried potatoes and a soaking of olive oil. And what comes to the table is more than food. It's landscape on a plate. In Fall River, this dish wasn't for any odd Tuesday. It was reserved, revered, pulled out for feast days, long Sundays when hands were finally at rest. Pork was a treasure, and clams had to be caught or bought with care, so when this dish appeared, it meant something mattered. And somewhere in every bite, the memory of Portuguese coastal life rang clear. Wind-swept shores, family feasts, pride without pleasantries. Even now, local restaurants serve it proudly. One fork full, and you're not in a mill city anymore. You're standing on the edge of southern Portugal with your feet in both worlds. If you're enjoying this journey through flavor and history, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like these. And tell us in the comments, which dish so far feels familiar to you or reminds you of something your parents or grandparents made? There's so much more to taste. Let's keep going. Polvo grelhado. There was always a moment, a raised brow, a cautious glance, when someone saw the whole octopus slide into the pot. But polvo grelhado, once grilled and brushed with oil, transformed caution into awe. After a gentle simmering until tender, the octopus was laid over flames, kissed by smoke, then finished with garlic and parsley. The charred edges, soft meat, and sheen of olive oil whispered of something ancient and proud. In early Fall River homes, this wasn't a weeknight dinner. It was occasion food, weddings, feast days, reunions. It was bold. It was a reminder that no matter how unfamiliar America felt, the tides of the Azores still churned in memory. Even children, hesitant at first, were won over by the delicious drama of it. And today, in the heart of the city, you'll still find polvo grelhado served with reverence. This isn't a curiosity for foodies. It's a flag planted in a new land, proof that tradition didn't just survive the ocean crossing. It thrived. Arroz de tamboril cum gambas, judged by ingredients alone, monkfish and shrimp rice doesn't seem revolutionary. But in the working-class kitchens of early Fall River, arroz de tamboril cum gambas was royalty, the kind declared only at Sunday tables. Monkfish, nicknamed the poor man's lobster, brought sweetness and firmness that withstood long simmers. Add shrimp, garlic, onion, and a rich tomato broth, and what emerged was a pot fragrant with sea air and full-body comfort. Many Portuguese immigrants who settled here had once fished back home. They knew how to handle the ocean's gifts. So when those same waters off New England delivered monkfish, it wasn't just luck. It was a sign they'd found another home. Children dug through steaming plates for shrimp tails, while parents savored slow spoonfuls of briny rice that soaked up every ounce of layered flavor. What looked like rice and seafood was so much more. It was a blend of heritage and adaptation, sea-meeting soil, old world stitched into the new. Moelas in kitchens where nothing could be spared. Moelas, chicken gizzard stew, turned frugality into art. These chewy little morsels, often discarded in wealthier homes, were carefully cleaned, then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, tomato, and spices until soft and flavorful. Sometimes white beans joined the pot, stretching it further. What began as scrap stew became a comfort beacon in tenement kitchens. The fragrance told stories, struggle, resourcefulness, creativity grounded in necessity. Kids dipped bread into the thick sauce, while parents lingered over slow bites, knowing this pot had been made not just with care, but with community in mind. When food was scarce, moelas delivered generous flavor for pennies. And outsiders may not have understood the appeal, but for Portuguese families, this was legacy, a stew steeped in patience and love, built from what others might have thrown away. Even 100 years later, moela still bubbles in taverns and kitchens, never once losing its place as a symbol of homegrown pride. Caldo verde. If any dish could be called the soul of the Portuguese table, it was caldo verde. And in Fall River's cold Milltown nights, that soul ran deep. Made with little more than potatoes, kale, water, and love, this green soup was ladled into bowls by mothers whose hands knew work and wisdom. Potatoes were mashed into a smooth, silky broth. Thin strips of dark kale floated like ribbons, softened just enough to melt. And then came the finishing note. Slices of linguiça, just enough to perfume the pot with smoked spice. In drafty apartments where coats were sometimes worn indoors, caldo verde was warmth you could hold in your hands. A single pot stretched far, enough for dinner and tomorrow's lunch. Bread on the side made it complete, but what really settled in the chest wasn't just the nourishment, it was the familiarity, the memory in every mouthful. That's why caldo verde still headlines every feast, festival, and holiday in Fall River. It's not just soup, it's heritage you can sip. Carne de vinha d'Alhos. Before Caribbean and Hawaiian cuisines gave it their own spin, carne de vinha d'Alhos lived in the Portuguese kitchens of Fall River as a proud original. This was marinade magic, chunks of pork awash in garlic, vinegar, wine, and spices overnight. Cooking it was like lighting a signal. The scent of garlic and wine curling through stairwells let neighbors know something special simmered inside. The acid in the marinade did double duty, flavoring and preserving, essential in an era when refrigeration was rare. Poured into heavy pots and left to cook low and slow, the pork turned tender, tangy, and irresistible. It wasn't a dish made casually. It was for Sundays and celebrations when families had the time to gather. With crusty bread or boiled potatoes, every bite delivered rustic delight. But more than anything, it was continuity. Carne de vinha d'Alhos taught generations that simple ingredients and serious care could birth something lasting. Something bold enough to cross oceans and bold enough to stay. Arroz de pato. When it came time to impress, to shine, Portuguese families turned to arroz de pato, duck rice. It sounded simple, but the preparation was an orchestration of patience and pride. Duck meat simmered until it slid off the bone. Tender shreds were folded into seasoned rice swollen with garlic, onions, and golden broth. Then came the performance. Chorizo slices fanned across the top before the whole dish went into the oven to bake. The smell alone stirred mouths to water. This wasn't everyday food. Duck was expensive, a luxury tucked away for celebrations. Baptisms, weddings, Sundays when the whole family sat elbow to elbow. And when it hit the table, everything paused. One spoon might bring crispy edges, another the silk of broth-drenched rice, another a ribbon of sausage spice. This dish didn't just satisfy, it elevated. In the tough rhythm of mill life, arroz de pato was a reminder. No matter the labor, tradition could still find ways to rise, golden, savory, and proud. Ardosia de peixe, Fridays meant fish. It was less about choice and more about faith, and the ardosia de peixe rose to the occasion every week. This fish slate was simple, honest fare. Cod, hake, or whatever the fisherman could spare, boiled or grilled gently alongside potatoes and greens. Maybe a drizzle of olive oil, maybe a wedge of lemon. No flourishes, no frills, just clean, confident flavors from sea and soil. In the Catholic homes of early Fall River, abstaining from meat on Fridays wasn't just rule, it was ritual. The city's Portuguese families, anchored to both religion and memory, turned Fish Day into a modest celebration. Children might dream of sausages, but parents knew this meal carried something sacred. It was nourishment of body and spirit. And even a century later, the same plates are served for the same reasons. Not because they impress, but because they endure. Ardosia de peixe reminds us, sometimes the most meaningful meals are the quietest. Tripas à moda do Porto. Tripas à moda do Porto didn't whisper comfort. It shouted resilience. This northern Portuguese stew took tripe, the part of the animal least appreciated, and honored it with time, spice, and skill. Slowly simmered with onions, carrots, beans, and often chorizo or bacon, the ingredients fused into a subtle, savory triumph of thrift. The story, passed down in generations, says this dish was born of sacrifice. Porto's people handed their best meat to soldiers and made greatness from what remained. In Fall River's immigrant neighborhoods, that spirit lived on. When money was tight and mouths were many, tripas filled bowls affordably and beautifully. It wasn't flashy, but it tasted of care and cleverness. Families served it proudly because eating tripas meant more than eating stew. It meant honoring every bite. Even now, when life is less harsh and ingredients more plentiful, some Fall River kitchens still reserve a spot on the table for this deeper kind of pride. One that comes not from luxury, but from love. Feijoada portuguesa. If there was one pot that could bring 15 people to a two-person table, it was feijoada portuguesa. This was comfort food with deep roots and no limits. Beans formed the base, red or white, slow-cooked with pork, chorizo, bits of salted bacon, and any vegetables within reach. Cabbage, carrots, onions. Even scraps turned sacred in this stew. In the tenement kitchens of Fall River, feijoada meant possibility. One pot could simmer all day, turn tougher cuts tender, and feed an army of relatives, friends, or neighbors who'd just drop by around mealtime. Served with rice or potatoes, it always ran deep, in flavor and in feeling. It wasn't fancy, but no one left hungry. Talking, laughing, dipping bread into bowls. These moments made feijoada more than a meal. It carried tradition, yes, but also togetherness. Even 100 years on, when this dish hits the table, it's not only a nod to thrift and taste. It's a celebration of survival and community in every spoonful. Massa sovada. Somehow, sweetness had a scent, and in Fall River, it smelled like massa sovada rising in a warm kitchen. Rich with eggs, sugar, butter, and faith, this Azorean sweetbread was a staple of joy, braided into loaves golden on the outside and impossibly soft inside. It wasn't everyday fare. This was Easter morning food, festival table food, the kind that said something important was near. Moms and grandmothers kneaded it by hand, watching the dough double in size with pride and anticipation. Children crowded around, waiting for that first thick slice slathered in butter or jam. One loaf might feed a family for days, though it rarely lasted that long. Massa sovada was more than soft bread. It was part of the identity kneaded into the life of Portuguese homes. A freshly baked loaf meant company was coming, or love was being shared, or simply tradition refused to be forgotten. Today, walk into a local bakery, and that same heavenly scent will tell you, the past is still deliciously alive. Pastéis de nata, among all the sweets that lined the shelves of Portuguese bakeries. None glowed quite like pastéis de nata, these little custard tarts. Born in Lisbon and reborn in Fall River, packed elegance into the palm of a hand. A crackly golden pastry shell cradled warm, silky custard, gently sweet, kissed with vanilla, lemon, and cinnamon. Served fresh from the oven, they vanished as quickly as they'd come. Families stopped at bakeries after Mass, justifying the splurge with joy. Children pressed their noses to the glass, eyes wide. Even when pennies were stretched thin, there was always a way to buy just one. That single tart felt indulgent, a pocket-sized reminder of faraway streets and the sweetness left behind. But don't mistake their size for smallness. These pastries carried pride, craft, and care through generations. And they still do. In every bite of pastéis de nata, there's a story that survived the crossing. One that says even the hardest lives deserve little luxuries, especially the kind that come with powdered sugar. Peixinhos da horta only in a Portuguese kitchen could green beans turn into gold. Enter peixinhos da horta, little fish from the garden, a dish that delighted without grandeur. Fresh green beans were dipped in batter, then fried till crisp and golden, their wriggled shapes mimicking tiny fish. The name was playful, the taste was magic. In early Fall River, these were the snacks of the people. Beans were cheap, backyard grown and filling, perfect for big families. Once fried, they became something more, crunchy, savory, with a hint of garlic or vinegar to sharpen the bite. Children grabbed them by the handful, munching like candy. After long shifts, tired workers found comfort in their crisp simplicity. And here's a twist of fate. This humble snack once inspired Japan's now legendary tempura centuries ago. But here in Fall River, peixinhos stayed close to their origin, passed from garden to frying pan to table. They remind us that even the simplest homegrown fare can echo across the globe and still belong to the heart. Arroz de marisco with chorizo. It was already good, but then chorizo took it to the next level. Arroz de marisco with chorizo was where elegance met fire. A bowl of seafood rice alone, clams, mussels, shrimp, captured the bounty of the ocean. But Portuguese sausage changed the game. Smoky and spicy, it melted into the broth, mingling with garlic, paprika, and tomato, until every grain pulsed with flavor. Fishermen brought the shellfish, yes, but it was chorizo, hanging in kitchens and corner shops, that gave the dish its soul. Big pots were cooked at community gatherings, each scoop stained red from the saffron and sausage oil swirling together. Families gathered around, laughing, shouting over spoons, heaping bowls with pride. This was more than a hunger cure. It was a story of balance, sea and land, fire and salt, old world and new. Even now, it remains a symbol on any Fall River table. A dish that proves, when flavors collide beautifully, identity isn't lost. It's magnified, one vibrant spoonful at a time. Polvo a lagareiro. When it was time to raise the bar, Portuguese families didn't just serve a meal. They served polvo a lagareiro. This dish turned octopus into celebration. After slow boiling to tender perfection, the whole creature was roasted in a blazing oven beside potatoes, bathed in generous lashings of olive oil and garlic. The result? Curling tentacles with crisped edges, soft meat, and an aroma that could stop conversations mid-sentence. In early 1900s Fall River, octopus was a luxury, too prized for routine, too meaningful for mediocrity. It appeared on special tables during weddings, feast days, and long holiday evenings, when every seat was filled and every voice overlapped. Kids whispered about it like folklore, the big dish that meant the whole family showed up. And when it finally hit the table, silence often followed. Reverence came baked in. Even today, polvo a lagareiro is served proudly across the city, a dish that proves celebration isn't about material wealth. It's about honoring where you come from, with flavor bold enough to carry it forward. Caldeirada de peixe. To taste your caldeirada de peixe is to taste the ocean, not just in ingredients, but in soul. This fisherman's stew refused to follow a script. Cod, mackerel, haddock, maybe even eel. Whatever the boats brought back, that's what went in the pot. The fish swam with onions, tomatoes, potatoes, and carrots, all simmering slowly until they softened and shared their secrets. A final swirl of olive oil and dash of paprika pulled it together like sunlight on moving water. In early Fall River, this was the food of the harbor. Families with ties to the docks would haul home fish too modest for market. No waste, just warmth. Caldeirada didn't need luxury to taste extraordinary. It turned humble cuts into poetry, feeding many on very little. For immigrant families staring at a new horizon but longing for their old shores, this pot said, "You belong to both." That's the gift of Caldeirada. It turns what's available into something unforgettable, steeped in sea salt, smoke, and stubborn hope. Cabrito asado. When everything had to be just right, when the moment truly mattered, Portuguese kitchens in Fall River turned to cabrito asado, roast goat. Prepared with reverence, this dish began days ahead with a marinade of garlic, olive oil, wine, and herbs. Then came hours of roasting, low and slow, until the meat surrendered and the skin crisped and browned to perfection. Whole neighborhoods knew what was cooking just by the scent that floated down the streets. Goat wasn't a meat found at the corner store. It was tradition, often raised or requested in advance, reserved for Easter, weddings, and church festivals. The roasting pan carried more than food. It held pride and purpose. Potatoes nestled around the goat soaked up every fiery drip, turning simple starch into something celebratory. Families gathered close. Dishes clanked. Wine was passed around. And when the first slice was served, it confirmed this was no ordinary meal. Cabrito said, "We remember who we are, even here, even now, and always at the table." Arroz doce. Before the dishes were cleared and the stories faded into laughter, there came a final note. Arroz doce. Sweet Portuguese rice pudding. A dish of softness and stillness, made with short grain rice, milk, sugar, and the whisper of lemon zest. It simmered patiently, like it knew what it represented. Once thick and creamy, it was poured into bowls and topped with warm cinnamon, often in beautiful crosshatch patterns drawn with spoons or fingertips. For baptisms, birthdays, Christmas lights flickering in tenement windows, this dish held moments. This was dessert as an embrace. As children scraped the pot for sticky edges, mothers and grandmothers told stories wrapped around every stir. Leftovers were packed in small bowls for guests, often handed out with warmth instead of wrapping. Arroz doce never needed flash. Its comfort was quiet but powerful, its sweetness just enough to linger. And to this day, no Portuguese gathering in Fall River feels entirely finished without it. Because some flavors don't just fill you, they anchor you. Doce de ovos and folares. At the intersection of faith and flavor sat two cornerstones of Portuguese celebration, doce de ovos and folares. The first, tender golden cakes crafted from egg yolks and sugar, bright and rich, soft as prayer. The second, sweet yeasted breads wrapped around a hard-boiled egg, each one kneaded not only with butter and cinnamon but with meaning. Folares were sacred symbols of rebirth and renewal, baked especially for Holy Ghost festivals and passed from household to household with pride. In the crowded kitchens of early Fall River, women worked side by side, elbow to elbow, mixing batches as children peeked over counters. The smells of sweet bread, warm ovens, egg custard, drifted down blocks and invited everyone close. And right there in the middle of tenement life, oven doors opened like cathedral windows. These weren't merely desserts. They were traditions you could taste, rituals disguised as recipes. A century later, their place hasn't changed. They still mark beginnings. They still fill rooms with gratitude. And they still offer proof that faith will always rise when it smells like home. In the end, these 25 dishes weren't just food. They were survival strategies dressed in garlic and wine. They were resilience disguised as cod and bread. They were love stories stirred into pots and roasted in ovens. In the early 1900s, Portuguese immigrants in Fall River brought more than hands and backs to the mills. They brought flavors no hardship could strip away. Each dish became a memory on a plate, wrapped in strain but steeped in pride. And here's the truth, you can still find them all. On Columbia Street, in church halls, at family grilling stations behind three-decker homes. The same chorizo still sizzles, and the same massa sovada still perfumes the air. Food kept this community together when everything else tried to pull it apart, and it still does. So if your heart's ever been stirred by history, if a taste has brought you farther than time ever could, don't stop here. There are more recipes like this waiting to be rediscovered, more stories tucked between breadcrumbs and steam. Because these aren't just meals. They're living traditions, handwritten on flour-dusted pages, passed by hand, and kept alive at every table that refuses to forget.